At 10, his fall from grace is now complete. Hugh Edwards is spared jail but receives a suspended sentence for making indecent images of children. The former news presenter had already pleaded guilty to 3 charges. We'll analyse the sentence and what the case means for the BBC, which says Edwards betrayed the audiences who trusted him. Also tonight, an end to the junior doctors' pay dispute. They accept a 22% rise. The government says the deal is key for the NHS.
Now we can draw a line under this bitter dispute, cut waiting lists and get our NHS not just back on its feet but fit for the future.
The moment the suspect, Ryan Routh, is arrested on suspicion of attempting to assassinate Donald Trump. Condemnation over the incident from the White House.
No place in political violence for political violence in America. None. Zero. Never.
Wreckage of the Titan submersible seen on the seabed for the first time as the final messages are revealed of those who died. And the long-awaited hearing gets underway into Manchester City's alleged breaches of Premier League financial rules.
And stay with us here on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Good evening. After admitting his crimes, today came the punishment. Hugh Edwards was spared jail, but received a 6-month suspended prison sentence on 3 charges of obtaining indecent images of children. One of the victims in the pictures is aged between 7 and 9. In all, 41 illegal images were sent to the former BBC News presenter, with his lawyer telling the court Edwards was profoundly sorry and that he recognised the repugnant nature of the images. The BBC says Edwards betrayed not just the corporation, but the audiences who put their trust in him. His name is now on the sex offenders register for the next 7 years. Lucy Manning has our top story.
Hugh Edwards facing the camera. Not his usual one in the BBC studios, but the Metropolitan Police's after he was arrested. This, his custody photo. A far cry from his smart on-screen image.
Mr. Edwards, do you apologise? Mr. Edwards, do you apologise for your crimes?
Now a convicted sex offender, he came with a suitcase, prepared if his punishment was prison. The court heard disturbing and graphic details of his crimes, descriptions of the videos of children, including one as young as 7 that he looked at, and money he gave to another sex offender who sent them to him. The images were discovered in the WhatsApp messages of Alex Williams, who sent them to Edwards. The police were unable to find the former newsreader's phone that he'd used to look at them. Edwards' responses to the 41 indecent images are particularly revealing. In one exchange, he describes the images Williams has sent as amazing. Williams then says he can try and get more videos. If you like, 13, 14, 15, 16. Months later, Edwards says, don't send underage. But in another exchange, when Williams describes images he's offering as young, Edwards replies, go on. As the judge sentenced him, he listened intently, emotional as the court heard about his mental health problems, his suicide risk, and an upbringing where his failure to get into Oxford left him feeling like an outsider at the BBC.
Edwards, through his barrister, apologised. He said he wanted the court to know how profoundly sorry he was, that the images were repugnant and he recognised the hurt done to those in them, that he had betrayed the trust and faith of so many people and hurt and damaged his family.
But the police clear that when Edwards looked at the pictures and videos, exploited children were the victims here.
Behind every image is a vulnerable child that has been violated, that has been subject to abuse, and the continuing sort of distribution of those images only goes to service that demand.
Tonight at 10, thousands of police.
Edwards was at the top of his career and the BBC, the man entrusted to tell the nation the Queen had died.
BBC television is broadcasting this special programme reporting the death of Her Majesty the Queen.
Reading the news until he became it. Initially suspended by the BBC last year in the aftermath of separate allegations in The Sun that he'd paid a young vulnerable man for explicit photos. The BBC, criticised for still paying him more than £200,000 after they knew he'd been arrested, said, "We are appalled by his crimes. He has betrayed not just the BBC, but audiences who put their trust in him."
It's very difficult to see any way that Hugh can come back. I think you should never say never in this industry. He certainly would never be employed as you know, the flagship presenter for a major broadcaster. Even those close to him had one view of who Hugh Edwards was, which is very different from the one that's been revealed in this process.
It is difficult to think of a more startling reversal of circumstances, from respected newsreader to convicted criminal. He'll now go on the sex offenders register. As the judge said, his reputation is in tatters. Edwards breaking not just the trust viewers placed in him, but the law. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Well, Katie Razzle is here along with Dominic Casciani. Dominic, to you first. Just explain the thinking behind this sentence.
Yeah, there's a lot of chat out there about whether this is a lenient sentence. It looks like it's pretty down the line of what someone in Hugh Edwards' position would expect. There's a variety of sentences for these type of offences, and in theory the maximum is 10 years, but that's only really reserved for the most severe producers of the images, not those who are the recipients. And the man who sent Hugh Edwards the images, Alex Williams, he got 12 months suspended for 2 years. So logically, Hugh Edwards was likely to get less. The key thing is how the Chief Magistrate then dealt with the mitigating factors. So he started with a 1-year term. He reduced that to reflect both the mitigation he'd received about Hugh Edwards' ill health, but also his early guilty plea. That took it down to 6 months. He then had to decide whether or not he posed a risk to the public, and he concluded there was no ongoing risk, so there's no need, this is the key thing here, there's no need to actually lock him up, and therefore he would be better served in the community on a suspended sentence with monitoring and the sex offender treatment programme. So he's not a free man in those terms, and he has to work through all of that in the months to come. OK,
Katie, the corporation says Edwards betrayed not just the folk here, frankly, including his former colleagues in the news division, but also the audiences who trusted him. Where does all this leave the BBC? Trusted him. Where does all this leave the BBC and the public's mind, do you think?
Yes, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but you go into journalism to be honest, to behave decently, to shine a light on wrongdoing. So hearing the graphic details of what happened to those children and Hugh Edwards' role in it has definitely shaken me to my core, and I think shaken many people. He was the face of this programme, the man entrusted with significant moments in our nation's history, and we now know he was leading a double life. As the BBC chair has put it, he's the villain. He's betrayed us, but, as you say, his actions have damaged the BBC's reputation and damaged trust. It's been very public and very bruising. We must never forget the victims, the children whose lives have been changed forever by what's happened to them. But the BBC does have questions to answer about why they continue to pay his salary after his arrest and before he resigned, but also about talent management. We heard in court today that he was misusing prescription drugs, that he was drinking, he was meeting strangers online, all at a time when he was presenting this programme. Were red flags missed? Were they ignored? These are all questions, and of course the BBC may hope to draw a line under this with this sentencing today, but is that right?
Yeah. All right. Katie, thank you. Katie Razzle, our culture editor, and Dominic Casciani, our legal affairs correspondent. Thank you. And there's a documentary, Hugh Edwards' Fall from Grace, available now on the BBC iPlayer. While Newsnight will have more analysis over on BBC Two shortly with Victoria. Hi there.
Hi, Clive. Yeah. So where does today's sentencing leave the BBC? Are they failing to learn some of the lessons of the past? We'll talk to a senior BBC insider and the journalist who broke the first story about Hugh Edwards. Newsnight 10:30, BBC Two, BBC News and iPlayer. See you then.
OK, thanks, Victoria. Now, junior doctors in England have accepted the government's offer of a 22% pay rise over 2 years, bringing to an end their long-running dispute. Over the course of 18 months, the doctors took part in 11 separate strikes. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, says the agreement is crucial for the NHS.
The deal we've reached with junior doctors is fair for them, but crucially fair for patients and the taxpayer, because now we can draw a line under this bitter dispute, cut waiting lists, and get our NHS not just back on its feet, but fit for the future.
We are bringing this current dispute of 2 years now to an end. It has taken far too long for the government to take any meaningful steps towards pay restoration. We are now in a process of turning that tide, and I hope that we can continue to make that journey into the future so that doctors don't have to strike over pay again.
Hugh Pym's here with me. We're heading to that crucial winter period, which is always awful for the NHS. But this time, no strikes.
Well, that's right, Clive. Real relief tonight amongst NHS managers in England that this dispute is at an end as things stand, and we won't get disruption over the crucial winter period as we did last year. So let's look at the details of the deal which has been agreed. A 22% pay rise over 2 years. The government topping up a bit what the Conservatives have been prepared to offer last year and more for this year, and that has now been accepted. Patients will also be relieved as well, because if you look at all industrial action in the NHS in England since the end of 2022, a total of 1.5 million appointments and operations were cancelled, contributing to the backlog. Now, as we heard, Wes Streeting says he's pleased at this outcome because he feels it paves the way for the reform plans he wants to put into place. The BMA, though, say, while they're pleased that their members have got this deal, which was much better than what was offered at the beginning, there is, quote, a long way to go in their pay campaign, and it is not over. So we may well hear more of this in the next wage round next year.
All right. OK. Hugh Pym, our health editor, thank you. The suspect arrested after an apparent second assassination attempt in 2 months on the life of Donald Trump has appeared in court in Florida. Ryan Routh was detained after Secret Service agents opened fire at a golf course where the former president was playing. They'd spotted an assault rifle in bushes a few hundred yards from Mr. Trump, who was unharmed. Sarah Smith has the latest from Florida.
Driver! Walk straight back!
This is the moment officers ordered Ryan Routh out of his car, hands above his head,
Keep walking!
before he was swiftly handcuffed and arrested. The 58-year-old had spent over 12 hours waiting for Donald Trump.
From North Carolina originally.
2 years ago, he spoke to Newsweek from Ukraine about his attempts to recruit volunteers to fight invading Russian forces.
If the governments will not send their official military, then we civilians have to pick up the torch and make this thing happen.
In one social media post, he said he was prepared to die in Ukraine. In another, he mentioned voting for Donald Trump in 2016, but claims to have become disillusioned. Donald Trump was playing golf on his own course when Secret Service agents spotted a rifle sticking out of the bushes. Agents opened fire 4 or 5 times, and the suspect fled the scene. The Secret Service said President Biden had already ordered increased security for Donald Trump, and that it was in place yesterday.
And the agents' hypervigilance and the detailed swift action was textbook. And I commend them and our partners for an exemplary response in keeping former President Trump safe.
At the scene, 2 backpacks were recovered along with a rifle and scope as well as a camera, all far too close for comfort to former President Trump. Joe Biden said today there is no place in America for political violence.
I've always condemned political violence. I always will in America. In America, we resolve our differences peacefully at the ballot box, not at the end of a gun. America suffered too many times the tragedy of an assassin's bullet.
Take a look at what happened.
Since the first assassination attempt against Mr. Trump 2 months ago, when he was slightly injured and one supporter killed, there have been concerns about the level of protection he's getting and whether it's enough. He said today, the suspect believed the rhetoric of Biden and Harris and he acted on it. Their rhetoric is causing me to be shot at when I'm the one who's going to save the country and they are the ones that are destroying the country. In last week's presidential debate, Mr. Trump appeared to blame Democrats for the first attempt on his life.
I probably took a bullet to the head because of
the things that they say about me. They talk about democracy. I'm a threat to democracy. They're the threat to democracy.
Vice President Kamala Harris said in a statement, "There is no place for political violence in our country. I've directed my team to continue to ensure that Secret Service has every resource, capability and protective measure necessary to ensure the former president's safety." Ryan Ruth appeared in court this morning charged with illegal possession of a firearm. More serious charges may follow, and he will be held in custody until a detention hearing next week. Sarah Smith, BBC News, West Palm Beach, Florida.
More from Sarah in a moment, but many are wondering why security around the former president wasn't tighter, why the entire golf course where he was playing hadn't been cordoned off. As we just heard, security for presidential candidates falls short of the attention paid to sitting presidents by the Secret Service. Here's Ros Atkins.
The Trump International Golf Club spreads across 330 acres, and Donald Trump plays there regularly. Located in West Palm Beach in Florida, the course is a 10-minute drive from his home at Mar-a-Lago. The course is a 10-minute drive from his home at Mar-a-Lago. The club's perimeter is more than 3 miles long. This is one part of it, right by a public road. There's a chain-link fence. Beyond that, you can easily see the course. And this was the route Donald Trump was taking during his round. He'd reached hole 5. According to police, as the former president played, Secret Service agents walked one hole ahead, as is standard. And we're told those agents spotted a rifle sticking out of the fence. BBC Verifiers concluded it was somewhere in this area, which was later cordoned off. Police say Donald Trump was between 300 and 500 yards away, within range of the rifle. These events in Florida happened while Mr. Trump's safety during this election campaign was already under greater scrutiny because of a major security failure in July. At a rally in Pennsylvania, a gunman shot at Trump, hitting his ear and killing a bystander. The head of the Secret Service resigned days later. The Secret Service said they had increased the amount of assets protecting Donald Trump. But Mr. Trump isn't president, and that's a factor.
At this level that he is at right now, he's not the sitting president. If he was, we would have had this entire golf course around it. But because he's not, the security is limited to the areas that the Secret Service deems possible.
This raises questions about what is possible, and if the candidates in this presidential election can be kept safe, especially in locations they're known to visit frequently. And while Americans seek answers, the authorities say the threat level remains high.
Ros Atkins reporting there. Let's return to Sarah in Florida. Will we now see, do you think, Sarah, tightening up of the security around not just Mr. Trump, but also Kamala Harris?
Well, interestingly, the acting director of the Secret Service just said to us in the last hour or so that the footprint of security around Donald Trump now is very similar to what he had when he was president. And that is because after that attempt in his life 2 months ago in Pennsylvania, President Biden ordered that both former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris receive the very highest levels of Secret Service protection. And those increased assets, we're told, were in place yesterday protecting Donald Trump. One thing that I think is quite different, though, from a couple of months ago after that first attempt in his life is how he is prepared to directly blame his political opponents for what he says is rhetoric that is causing these attempts on his life, saying that it's incendiary language that is doing this in this rather overheated election campaign.
All right, Sarah, thank you. Sarah Smith there, our North America editor in Florida. Now, in America, a public hearing into the Titan submersible disaster has revealed the final text messages sent by those on board to the mothership on the surface as they headed towards the wreck of the Titanic. One read, "All good here," before the craft imploded and killed those on board. The hearings being held by the US Coast Guard will assess what went wrong and whether the accident could have been prevented. Here's Rebecca Morell.
The wreckage of OceanGate's Titan sub. Its tail cone lying nearly 3,800 metres down on the Atlantic sea floor. It was taking passengers to the Titanic when it imploded, killing all 5 people on board. Those who died were British explorer Hamish Harding, Suleiman Dawood and his father, British-Pakistani businessman Shahzada Dawood, French diver P.H. Nagialet and Stockton Rush, OceanGate's CEO.
I would like to ask that everyone present please stand for a moment of silence in respect to those persons who perished as a result of this casualty.
Now a public hearing has started to establish exactly what went wrong.
This is a full-scale model of OceanGate's Titan sub. We've heard more about its previous expeditions. It went to the Titanic wreck site 13 times in 2021 and 2022. And during those 2 years, there were 118 things that went wrong with the sub, including the front dome falling off when it was brought out of the sea, its thrusters, which steered the craft, failing at 3,500 metres, and its batteries died on one dive, leaving the passengers stuck inside for 27 hours. We also learnt the timeline of its final dive and the last few text messages sent between the sub and the surface. Titan began its dive at 9:14 in the morning local time. At 9:18, there was a communications check. After that, comms were patchy. About an hour into the dive, at 10:16, Titan sent a message saying, "All good here." And at 10:25, at a depth of 2,600 metres, it said it was to the southeast of the Titanic's bow. The last message was sent at 10:47 at a depth of 3,346 metres. Titan said it had dropped 2 weights. After that, communication was lost. The sub had imploded. But there's nothing in the messages to suggest that the passengers on board had any idea that anything was wrong.
The meeting heard why Stockton Rush didn't want an independent safety assessment.
Stockton's first issue was time and cost. It could take too long and way too expensive. It's ridiculous. And in his words, it stifles innovation. I said, well, you could still be innovative.
The hearings into the Titan disaster continue for 2 more weeks. Rebecca Morrell, BBC News.
At least 16 people are now thought to have died after catastrophic flooding caused by a powerful storm across several countries in Central Europe. The damage from Germany all the way across to Romania has left thousands homeless, and for some areas more bad weather is on the way. The mayor of the Polish city of Nysa has asked all 44,000 residents to evacuate, as Sarah Rainsford reports now from the Czech-Polish border.
In the flood zone of Poland, there is an urgent call to evacuate. Fears that a stretch of embankment could collapse after days battered by a river, swollen by torrential rain. Not far from here, a dam has burst. The pressure is increasing. Nysa has already flooded, but it could get much worse. So residents like Teresa have been told to get out to higher ground. It's the weather, it's nature. What can you do, she tells me. But nature is powerful. It smashed up the main bridge in the next town and plunged Głuchoładzi underwater. When the flood subsided, there was chaos and filth everywhere. Right into the houses. Można? How high did the water come?
The water come to this.
Krzysztof and his family had only just decorated. All this was brand new.
Everything is damaged. Everything, money, what we have was for repaired, and now we don't have nothing.
Just water everywhere. His neighbour tells me she fled when the water came rushing in.
Was it scary when it was coming?
Yes, I'm scared.
Recovering from this won't be easy. And the danger recovering from this won't be easy. And the danger still hasn't passed. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, in Głuchoładzi.
At least 2 people have died after wildfires spread in central and northern Portugal. Villages have been evacuated and motorways closed while the EU has been asked to send more water-bombing aircraft. Portugal's experiencing unusually dry conditions with strong winds fanning the fires. Now, they've been the Premier League's powerhouse team for more than a decade, but now Manchester City are facing the biggest disciplinary case in the history of English football. An independent commission hearing into alleged breaches of Premier League financial rules has begun, with the club facing 115 charges. They deny any wrongdoing, but if found guilty, possible sanctions could include a fine, points deduction, or even relegation. Here's Dan Rowan.
Manchester City, champions again. They've achieved unprecedented domination of English football. Manchester City this year becoming the first club ever to win 4 top-flight titles in a row. But off the pitch, the champions have also been fighting a catalogue of Premier League charges over alleged financial rule breaches.
Are you confident?
This morning, Lord Panic KC, who's heading up City's legal team, arrived for the start of an independent commission hearing into the case in central London. The club denies wrongdoing, and on Friday, the manager addressed the issue.
We believe we have not done anything wrong, so we go to independent panel and we are going to wait.
The 115 charges relate to 14 seasons after City's Abu Dhabi takeover in 2008 transformed it into one of the richest clubs in the world. They include 54 counts of not providing accurate financial information, 14 counts of not providing full details for manager and player payments, and 35 counts of failure to cooperate with the Premier League's investigation. City have long denied allegations they artificially inflated sponsorship revenue by channeling investment from their owner via Abu Dhabi-based companies to help it get round rules that limit spending on players. Last month, the man in charge of the Premier League told me a case that had been dragging on for years was finally nearing a conclusion.
We have a big, thick rule book, and part of any sporting competition is a commitment, a central commitment to uphold those rules. And whilst it does create difficulties, there is no happy alternative to enforcing rules.
Everton were hit with points deductions for breaching financial rules last season, and City could be looking at a similar punishment or even expulsion from the league if found guilty of the most serious charges.
Well, I think it would be a sporting disaster if my club's found guilty in the end, because Pep Guardiola and the club have done a wonderful thing, and the football they play and what they produced is amazing.
Manchester City say they have a body of irrefutable evidence to support their case. But with the hearings set to last 10 weeks, they and their fans now face a nervous wait. Dan Rowan, BBC News at the Etihad Stadium.
The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey, has called for further spending on health and social care, as well as reforms to the NHS. He's been speaking to Chris Mason at the Lib Dem conference in Brighton.
There is a sunny and bright mood among Liberal Democrats. Little wonder they now have a record-breaking 72 MPs and a leader standing tall.
We got our best ever results.
Sir Ed Davey will tell anyone who'll listen he wants to focus on the NHS and social care.
Do you accept, as the government says, that the NHS is broken?
Broadly, yes. I mean, in so many parts of the country, it's under real stress. And it has to have investment, it has to have reform.
Lord Darcy, former surgeon, former Labour minister, he says one of the reasons the NHS is broken is, as he puts it, austerity. Do you take responsibility for that? You were in government, you were in cabinet.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the NHS over decades, you'll find several things. First of all, the underinvestment in the health infrastructure. You'll also see it's a history of failed reorganisations. It's littered with that.
Well, Lord Darcy's saying there was a lack of funding and a massive botched reorganisation on your watch.
We fought the Conservatives to make sure that there was more money going in. I think without us, the problems would have been worse.
Daft stunts in front of the cameras was Ed Davey's big thing at the election. Today, bubbly on a Monday morning can't be bad. His MPs now represent some of the richest parts of the country.
The Monday Club.
The Monday
Group.
Inheritance tax, would you put that up?
I think reforming it would mean that people who are on relatively modest levels of inheritance...
Like what?
Well, I mean, a lot of people's homes in many areas of the country are quite valuable, and they end up being clobbered by inheritance tax, and I think that's unfair.
Wouldn't the reality of that is that those who've got the snazzy accountants wouldn't pay it anyway, and those who are currently paying it would stop paying it? That would be a revenue stream gone.
We've allowed snazzy accountants, to use your phrase, to enable people to do a lot of tax planning and to avoid it, and we've got to stop that.
Oh, and with a row about a Labour donor paying for the Prime Minister and his wife's clothes.
Do you pay for your own suits?
The vast majority, but if you look at
all of them.
a few years ago, someone was kind enough to pay for a suit for me, and it's on my record.
Okay, what about that one?
This one. I think I paid for this one.
For now, Ed Davey is determined to enjoy his recent success. The last decade or so has brought the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. Chris Mason, BBC News in Brighton.
On a day of shame for Edwards, how damaging is it for the BBC? Hello, welcome to Newsnight, live each weeknight. Some of the new details that were revealed at Westminster Magistrates Court today as Hugh Edwards was given a 6-month suspended jail term for having child sexual abuse images on his phone was disturbing and harrowing. I'm going to report a brief extract from the hearing, which I want to let you know is graphic and upsetting. And if you don't wish to hear it, please turn the volume down for the next 45 seconds or so. The reason I'm going to read it to you is because it featured in open court today, and it makes clear the seriousness of some of the images that Edwards had on his phone. The court heard that the 63-year-old knew exactly what he was looking at when he was sent 41 illegal photos and videos of children being sexually abused. Children aged between 13 and 15 years old. And a video involving a primary school-aged child. This showed, and I'm quoting from court documents now, a male child aged around 7 to 9, with his trousers pulled down and his mouth being penetrated by a penis. Some of the images sent to the ex-presenter had the ages of the young people in and used the word adolescence. When the man sending them, a now convicted paedophile called Alex Williams, asked if he wanted more images of young people, Edwards replied, "Go on." But also, Edwards told him, "Don't send anything underage." The court heard Edwards paid Williams by way of an apparent thank you, but said he didn't remember opening any of the images. The Chief Magistrate, in his sentencing remarks, said he didn't believe Edwards represented a danger to children. He believed he could be rehabilitated, was suffering from a mental health disorder, and his remorse was genuine. Here's what the National Crime Agency told the BBC today about the re-traumatising effect of such child sexual abuse images.
Behind every image is a vulnerable child that has been exploited and has been abused. And every time that that image is viewed, circulated, and distributed again and again and again leads to re-victimise that child and continue that level of abuse.
The court heard the ex-presenter was profoundly sorry and recognised the repugnant nature of such images and the hurt that was done to those who appeared in them. Today's sentence completed the downfall of BBC News' highest paid presenter, a presenter that continued to be paid by the corporation after he was arrested last November. Top BBC bosses were told back then about the arrest by the Met, who asked senior management to keep it confidential. Last week, the BBC's Director General revealed he'd made a formal request to Edwards to pay back £200,000 of last year's estimated £475,000 salary. Today, the BBC said it was appalled by his crimes. So tonight, what are the questions still outstanding for the BBC over the way they handle this? Has the corporation really learned the comprehensive lessons after Stuart Hall and Jimmy Savile? Our panel tonight, political commentator Adam Bolton, who was a friend of Edwards but hasn't spoken to him or been in contact with him since last July. Former Shadow Culture Secretary Thangam Debonair is here. Later in the programme, we'll talk to former BBC Director of Television Alan Yentop, who was Edwards' boss for a period. First, we have the journalist who broke the original story for The Sun in July 2023 about a then unnamed BBC presenter paying a 17-year-old thousands of pounds in exchange for explicit images. Scarlett House, welcome to Newsnight. The mum and the stepdad of the young man who was paid that money by Edwards, who went to The Sun last year, what's their reaction to the sentence today?
So they are absolutely devastated by the result of the sentencing. I spoke to the mother earlier on and she said that she was really upset by how soft it is, that a man who's in his 60s who received a video and images of children that young should be locked up. There's also an issue here as well in terms of some of the remarks that were made that he's remorseful. They don't feel that he's remorseful because he's never apologised to them for what's happened to their son. He's never even spoken out about it, so they don't feel there's remorse there at all.
Okay. And they told you, when they came to The Sun, of the way the BBC was investigating their complaint, and their complaint to the BBC was, please can Hugh Edwards stop paying our son thousands of pounds in exchange for explicit images. What kind of things did they say to you about the BBC investigation?
So first of all, they came to us and said that they had gone to the BBC originally to make a complaint about Edwards' behaviour towards their son, and that complaint was ignored, which is the reason they came to us. And after we published the story, the BBC launched an investigation, a fact-finding inquiry into what happened. Throughout the investigation, they felt that it was incredibly slow. Nothing was really happening. The stepfather would call the lead investigator multiple times to ask what had happened, what was happening, and Edwards, they said that Edwards hadn't even been interviewed during that time about the allegations, yeah, they were incredibly frustrated by what had happened.
And there was a point, I think, when the investigator said to them along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, you can tell us the specific words, essentially, don't worry, there's something bigger coming down the track?
Yeah, so they were very upset about, yeah, as I said, the progress of the investigation. An interview lasted, I think, about 50 minutes with them. The lead investigator, 50 minutes, yeah, 50 minutes, which is unbelievably short if you think about the amount of allegations they had and their claims. They spent 50 minutes with them, didn't even interview the mother properly. I think the lead investigator didn't even turn up to the interview. Never spoke to them really about it again, didn't see them in person again. Around Christmas time, the stepfather called up and asked what was happening, and they said, oh, you know, something else is happening, something big is happening, and that now we know is what is after Edwards was arrested.
You say you gave the BBC a dossier of multiple allegations involving alleged inappropriate behaviour by Hugh Edwards, and it involved complaints from BBC staff and people outside of the BBC. As far as you know, what did the BBC do with that information?
Well, we don't know because they didn't even contact the people that are involved in the dossier to tell them the investigation had closed. So they didn't even hear back from them. So that's the shocking part of it.
Can you give us some examples of what you put in that dossier?
It's just inappropriate behaviour. Obviously, you know, we can't go into a lot of what is in that dossier, but we have published some of it, and that's including a story that I was working on before I even spoke to the parents at the centre of our story, our original story in July, and that was a young man who Edwards was pestering for pictures, sending money to, and trying to meet up during lockdown, and he actually did meet him during lockdown. So there was that. And he actually did meet him during lockdown. So there was that. There was a colleague as well that felt uncomfortable with his behaviour.
BBC say, in the case of Hugh Edwards, we considered carefully all issues raised with us as part of a fact-finding disciplinary investigation, and that informed a confidential disciplinary process. During this period, he chose to resign and did so with immediate effect without notice or financial settlement. Do you think if the parents, the mum, the stepfather, had their complaints investigated more thoroughly, more swiftly, there might have been different decisions made by the BBC by the time the Met told them that Edwards was being arrested on suspicion of possession of child sexual abuse images?
I think definitely. I mean, and that's not just for me. I haven't just said that. That's you know, an independent investigation that was conducted by Deloitte. It said that the complaint system wasn't sufficient, and that the complaint was mishandled, and the BBC apologised to the parents for that. So there's definitely some kind of failing in that sense. Yeah.
Do they still want the outcome of that disciplinary inquiry?
Yes, yeah. Well, they have an apology and they feel somewhat vindicated, but they also feel like there's no closure. So, you know, they've gone through all of this, a year of hell really, to be told in April, when Edwards resigned, to be told, okay, that's it, case closed, the investigation is over. And, you know, they haven't had there's no transparency as to what was found out during that investigation, no apology really about what had actually happened. And they don't really know why it happened as well, how this was able to happen. And I think they want that investigation to continue. And also, you know, we have to remember that things have changed now as well, that the young person at the centre of this has spoken out about what has happened and has subsequently said that he has felt groomed by.
Because you were criticised at the time, yes, because you didn't include the young man's lawyer's denial that the whole story was rubbish.
Yes, of course, but you know, we made that decision because you know, the youngster is incredibly vulnerable, and we knew that Edwards was pressurising him to deny it. You know, he even paid him afterwards, after our story broke, and after that denial came out, he even paid him money.
Edwards paid the young man money.
And the young man has said that in an interview.
Yeah. Let me bring in Adam Bolton and Thangam Debonair. Thangam Debonair, with your former Shadow Culture Secretary hat on, how do you think the BBC have handled this?
Well, I think there's been obviously some difficult decisions had to be taken, and I do share my colleague Lisa Nandy, who's the current Culture Secretary. I share her desire for the salary to be repaid. I know that's what the BBC would like, and I know that's what the Culture Secretary would like. But if we can zoom out a little bit, I think it's important that we recognise a culture of power and power imbalances. That really matters, because in my previous role as Shadow Culture Secretary, but actually in previous jobs that I did with violent men who'd abused their partners and often their children as well, they thrived on a culture of power and a culture of imbalance of power, which allowed them to choose to abuse that power. Now, I've known a lot of powerful men. I've worked in politics, I've worked in the creative industries. Most do not choose to abuse that power, but it matters when people are prepared to challenge a culture of power imbalance or not. You have to be prepared to challenge, to stand up to resist, and to help support those who feel that they aren't able to challenge that power imbalance. I think that's important. I think the BBC has acknowledged that to an extent in the House of Lords committee inquiry last week. I'd like to urge them to look carefully at that. The culture of celebrity, the culture of powerful men, and it is mostly, though not always, men. Sure. It's really important that we resist that
spoiler alert, they have done that before. They have looked at the power imbalance with previous high-profile celebrity BBC presenters. Let me bring in Adam. How do you think the BBC BBC have handled this?
Well, I do think there are questions to answer. I mean, there is why they didn't respond to the initial complaint from the parents of the young man, why after the Sun had drawn attention to that lack of response, they clearly, as we've just heard from Scarlett, didn't really conduct an adequate inquiry. I do find it astonishing that at that stage they didn't speak to Hugh. I again find it, I don't think any commercial organisation could conceivably have gone on paying Hugh for the period of time that the BBC did, let alone once they were informed albeit in confidence, of the conditions in which he'd been arrested. And I also think there is a real question here about the way the BBC handles its talent. You know, of course there was a duty of care to the people that actually in this studio, Newsnight, revealed were worried about the way they'd been treated by Hugh, and of course there should have been a duty of care to the parents, but there also should have been a duty of care to Hugh, who appears to have been seriously spinning out of control. He was an important, prominent figure in the BBC, yet no one appears to have picked up on that or talked to him or helped him.
But the duty of care is one of the reasons why the BBC says, when it was informed of his arrest by the Metropolitan Police, and the Met told them to keep it confidential, they did. There was a duty of care. I mean, there was a duty of care to Edwards.
That's duty of cover-up rather than duty of care.
Well, you may say that, but as we know, you're innocent until proven guilty, and at that point, there was an arrest, not even a charge.
No, but I'm not even talking necessarily about at that point.
No, but you're talking about the salary issue.
No, well, I am mentioning the salary issue, and I think you can stop paying people if they reach a point, and I think anyone in a commercial organisation would have been fired. But when I talk about duty of care, I'm talking about this is clearly someone who is now, we understand, in a residential mental treatment, who clearly, I didn't know about it, I wasn't working in the BBC, but who clearly was causing some disturbance in the office, who was a very, very high profile figure within the BBC, who we now know people on social media knew about some of his activities, and yet the BBC either was unaware of it or chose not to raise it with him, and they didn't help him.
What about the duty of care, not just to Hugh Edwards, but of the current junior members of staff and the former junior members of BBC staff who were encouraged to come forward and give their testimony to HR in this disciplinary inquiry into Hugh Edwards?
Yes, that sounds to me like there's been some serious failings, but I want to draw attention to the fact the person responsible for Hugh Edwards' behaviour is Hugh Edwards. He pleaded guilty to these crimes. They are horrific crimes in which there are victims who've been abused multiple times. As your introduction described, the abuse took place when it happened, but also abuse continues when images are shared, when they are viewed, and when they are further shared. Each of those acts is a further act of victimisation. The person who is responsible for them is the person who pled guilty to those offences.
Well,
and I think that's mattered.
No one's excusing him.
No, I agree, but I want to make sure we don't lose sight of that, because I think that's
why I began the programme in the way I did.
I'm glad you did, because I think it's important that we do both things. Two things can be true at once. A person can have been responsible, and he pled guilty, and the institution that surrounds him may have failed to challenge those structures of power around him and failed in their duties of care.
But we do have to look at issues. You know, you mentioned at the beginning Jimmy Savile, you mentioned Stuart Hall, there are other people at the Jimmy Savile, you mentioned Stuart Hall, there are other people at the BBC who were caught up in Me Too, and you have to ask yourself why this has happened repeatedly.
I'm going to ask that question of Alan Yentob in just a moment, if I may. We'll be back with you. The BBC Director General Tim Davie appeared before the Lords Communication Committee last week. He had this to say about the decision he took when told by the Met that Edwards had been arrested in November on suspicion of making child abuse images.
As I said, it wasn't an easy decision. It was really difficult getting the balance right, because you knew that the arrest had been made, you knew that there were no charges. In that, you take advice, and you can always take risk, by the way. You can take risk in these situations and go against your policies. Being blunt, you can take the risk. There might be legal risks in that. There also might be significant welfare risks, because you've also got vulnerable individuals.
We asked Tim Davey for an interview tonight. It was declined. Let's speak to someone who knows what the thinking is at the top of BBC management. Somebody who's in the Director General's office pretty regularly, former BBC controller Alan Yentop. Thank you very much for being with us on Newsnight. Do you think the BBC could have done things differently?
I don't think there's any sense of complacency in the BBC about what's been going on. It's not just a question of a duty of care, there's a responsibility that the BBC has acknowledged. And you've heard what the board had to say about it, and there are obligations, legal obligations as well. The BBC has also now set up a working party to look at the culture of the BBC. It is looking very carefully at the complaint system. So there's no way that it is not taking this seriously at all.
But it sounds, I'll ask you again, could they have done anything differently?
Well, I think that they've acknowledged that there's a learning curve there. For instance, when Hugh Edwards was suspended, the question is, should he have been paid? And I think Tim and Samira and the board are thinking about, well, in future, if we know that something like this has happened, should that person be paid? And they are now addressing that question of payment. But of course, there are lawyers around, there are obligations and the rest of it.
When the Met informed top managers at the BBC that Edwards last November was arrested, what did the BBC do then?
The BBC very carefully, and with very few people, but senior figures in the BBC, looked at the obligations they had. The Metropolitan Police had said that they could not pronounce on this. They had been instructed to, and I noticed, interestingly, Victoria Newton, the editor of The Sun, said that she had a sense that this was going on, and they approached the Metropolitan Police, and the Metropolitan Police refused to comment.
It sounds like you're saying the BBC didn't do anything.
What do you mean I said they didn't do anything? What I'm saying
when the Met told them?
The Met was instructed by the BBC. The BBC was instructed, by the Met, that they were not to say anything about this.
Right.
So the BBC...
they did nothing?
Well, when you say they did nothing, they were told to do nothing.
No, they were told to keep it quiet.
Yes, and that's exactly what they did.
Sure. They weren't told to do nothing.
He was already suspended.
Yes.
And they were told that they could not comment on this at this point. I have to say the BBC has earlier experience, I'll acknowledge a failing with the Cliff Richard case, when they pronounced on that before there had been a court case. So they know that there's a risk there and they have to obey the law. And so did the Sun. The Sun too were told by the Metropolitan Police that they could not go there, and they didn't go there.
What about...
We weren't told with anything. We weren't told we couldn't go there.
No, you were told there was nothing, they were not prepared to comment.
Yes.
And Victoria decided she would not comment. Okay,
what
so
about
she
those
did...
current and former junior members of BBC staff who gave testimony to that internal inquiry into Edwards? Well, they've told us they haven't heard anything.
Well, I can't say too much about that because I'm not involved in that at all.
No, but let me tell you that they haven't been told anything, and it doesn't sound like they're ever going to find out the outcome or the conclusion.
They haven't gone public on this. I'm sure they've been spoken to, and obviously
some have, yeah, but they've not had any feedback.
It's been overtaken. Well, I can't comment on that. I haven't heard that. It's been overtaken by this terrible event and this.
So those people who took that really difficult decision for some of them, and I know that, to speak to HR, to tell them the way they felt they were treated by Hugh Edwards, they've had nothing.
Well, clearly Hugh Edwards was suspended anyway, and he has now been...
Sure, but you want to know what comes out of you giving testimony.
I can't answer that because I don't know the details.
No, but you might have an opinion. Has the BBC really learned all the lessons from Stuart Hall and Jimmy Savile? And the reason that I ask that is because I looked back at the conclusions of Dame Janet Smith's report into the abuse committed by Savile and Hall. And this is what she said in her conclusions in 2016. It's incumbent on the BBC to examine its culture, particularly when it comes to the continued fear of staff speaking out and its attitudes towards top on-air stars. That was 8 years ago. So it hasn't learned that lesson, has it?
I know, and I think there actually has...
Do you agree it hasn't?
No, I think there has been some progress, but maybe not enough. And the BBC is now readdressing that issue.
The same issue?
Yes, it is the same issue, but nevertheless, it has not been ignored. And these...
But it has in this case.
Well, you say it's been ignored. I don't agree with that. Okay. I think it has been addressed, but there are lessons to be learned.
Do you know when the report into the former Radio 1 DJ Tim Westwood is going to be published? He was accused of sexual misconduct by multiple women. The BBC announced an independent inquiry into him 2 years ago. Where is it?
I don't know, but obviously there are two cases. There's the Russell Brand case and there's the Tim Westwood case.
I'm asking about the Tim Westwood
case.
And
they are being looked at,
The KC, Gemma White, has given her report into the BBC.
Yes.
Is it going to be published?
I don't know what the timing is for that, but I'm sure it will be responded to.
Are you expecting it to be published?
Yes.
Are you hoping it will be?
Yes, I'm expecting it to be.
OK. Right. We're going to come back to you in just a moment because it's time for some politics. The Liberal Democrats are in Brighton this week. Oh no, I beg your pardon. We're going to Nick in a moment. I do apologise. Sorry. We're going to Brighton in a second. Alan Yentob says, Scarlett, that the BBC couldn't have done that much differently. Do you accept that?
No, being the person who has been through this so closely with the family and with other complainants as well, I would say they could definitely do something differently. They didn't take the family seriously. At all at the beginning, and neither do they take the family seriously really until Edwards was arrested.
But the Metropolitan Police made it clear that there was no criminal offence. The BBC waited for that report and it was given. So it's not to say that they did nothing about it because of
but
because
do you not
they
think that an abuse of power, grooming and paying somebody large...
Yes, but he was suspended.
Yes, but I'm talking about the actual investigation. The actual investigation was not
But as you know, the victim of this at this stage was actually defending it and refusing to acknowledge that this was going on.
We don't know whether the BBC actually even spoke to the victim.
No, but in publication, lawyers which represented, I don't know if they just represented both Hugh Edwards and the victim, were trying to stop it. So it was a complex situation.
Very complex, but there was an abundance of evidence as well.
I just wonder if you know why the BBC didn't take seriously the initial complaint. Why the BBC didn't take seriously the initial complaint, and then once the Sun had exposed it, why the BBC didn't at that point speak to Hugh Edwards, both of which...
The BBC consulted the police about it and reported it, so it's not as if they ignored it.
But this is about this is misconduct.
The bar was not about criminality. This is the defence. The bar was about allegations of bad behaviour, and we as journalists have, in all sorts of walks of life, have exposed people for bad behaviour which falls well short of criminality.
Adam, for you to talk about commercial organisations when the story of News Corporation in relation to hacking has been so extreme and they've been denied it.
And has been fully reported on Sky News.
Only after a long time.
No, at the time.
I don't like this differentiation between the commercial organisations being...
The point is, I think there is a structural fault with the BBC, which is when an allegation is made against individuals working for it, you take it as a corporate insult to the BBC, whereas I think in commercial organisations, they see it as a liability which they have to deal with, and that is the difference.
I'm sorry, I don't agree. And I would say that the BBC recently, it's made two decisions with
Jay Blaze
and James, and they have taken swift action.
And
so
maybe that's because
they have learned.
Hugh Edwards.
Yes, they have learned something.
Thang of Devon, can I ask you about the sentence? Because there's quite a lot of anger online about the what you described as the leniency of the sentence the parents of the young man do. I'll give you some comments. I'm so angry he's got away with it. It's a disgrace, an insult to every victim and survivor. And a lot of people are comparing it to those people who wrote horrible, horrible things on Facebook during the riots and have been jailed for 12 months, 15 months and longer. They weren't given suspended jail sentences. What's your view?
I think that we live in a time where child sexual abuse is so rife that we're drawing attention to it today because it is a presenter, it's someone who is well known, it's someone who's been in our living rooms through our TVs. And I think this is an opportunity for us to look harder at whether or not sentencing guidelines need to be re-examined. I think the anger that's been expressed by people, many others will feel the same. Of course, we were not in the courtroom, we didn't all hear what was put forward as mitigating and aggravating circumstances. However, the message that sends to victims of child sexual abuse is not great.
So are you calling for sentencing guidelines to be re-looked at?
I think it's inevitable that there will be wider calls for that, and I think that's some of the anger that you've seen there. But I think it's not the only problem here. The wider problem is that 1 in 20 children, according to the NSPCC, is likely to have been sexually abused at some point in their childhood. That's a lot of children, most of whose cases are not getting dealt with, and I think that's a bigger problem because we have the sharing of those images. It's a growing problem, the sharing of images through WhatsApp and other media. That's a big problem, and the sentencing guidelines is part of that, but there's a wider problem with the failure of the criminal justice system to be able to respond adequately.
I don't disagree with that. I think that's a very fair point, actually.
And now it's time for some politics. The Liberal Democrats are in Brighton this week for their annual conference, as you know, and Nick is there. Hi, Nick.
Well, Vic, we're 2.5 months on from the general election where the Liberal Democrats had a very successful result. 72 MPs up from 11 in 2019. So the mood here is very upbeat. But the big question is, where does this party go now? So at the moment, they seem to be positioning themselves to the left of Labour, to the left on winter fuel, to the left on how you fund the NHS. Now, earlier I caught up with Daisy Cooper, the deputy leader of the party, and I said, is that it? Are you following in the footsteps of the late Charles Kennedy, who went to the left of Tony Blair? Or, given that almost all the gains you made were in Conservative seats, and if you want to build on that, you need to take more Conservative seats, will you follow the example of Nick Clegg, who, of course, went to the right of Labour?
We're a Liberal Party. We're not going to define ourselves as left or right. We want to be a constructive opposition, and where we think Labour's getting it wrong, we'll say so. Today we've been setting out our policies on the NHS. We've been doing that throughout the entire conference, and right now we want to say to the government, we know you've got the budget coming up. We want the budget to be a budget to save the NHS and care. Take our ideas and we'll support you. But if we don't see the urgency that we need or the ambition that we want to see, we will hold you to account.
Well, earlier in her conference speech, Daisy Cooper gave a very moving account of the devastating impact of Crohn's disease on her in 2012. She was told that she would have 4 days to live unless she had major surgery. Now, Daisy Cooper talked about that to basically say how the NHS saved her life, and now the Liberal Democrats are campaigning on the pressures on the NHS. So I said to Daisy, say how the NHS saved her life, and now the Liberal Democrats are campaigning on the pressures on the NHS. So I said to Daisy Cooper, did she believe that if somebody was in her condition now, they would have received the same level of care that she received 12 years ago?
I am concerned, and I said in my speech earlier today, I think about a young person today who might be having the same symptoms. I worry that they may not be able to see a GP to get the kind of routine tests they might need to try and rule out other conditions. I worry that the scanners that were used, that were used on me may not be up to date, may not be efficient. I worry that maybe the staff are so overstretched that they wouldn't have the time that staff had with me 12 years ago, when they sit down and they hold your hand, they reassure you, they explain what the disease and how it's affecting you, they explain what the scan says and what procedures they need to take. And it does really worry me for young people of today, and people of all ages, because when you're ill, it's incredibly scary.
Daisy Cooper talking to Nick, and we'll be at the Labour conference next week in Liverpool. Let's have a look at some of tomorrow's front pages, starting with the Metro. Lucky Hugh. Because he avoided jail. Hugh Edwards avoids jail over images of child abuse. That's the Eye. Daily Express, reputation in tatters. Those are the words of the Chief Magistrate in court today over child abuse images. Daily Mail, disgraced, reviled, but not a day in jail. The Guardian, Hugh Edwards given suspended jail term over indecent images. And The Sun, sickening. He called child sex pics amazing. Saw vile videos and asked for more, but Edwards is not sent to jail. I read half a BBC statement earlier. I'm just going to read you the other half. It's particularly with reference to the junior members of staff and ex-junior members of BBC staff who contributed testimony to the internal inquiry into Hugh Edwards. The BBC statement goes on, we fully appreciate the complexities and confidentiality of this work can be frustrating for those who have come forward and shared their experiences. But we're extremely grateful to everyone who did so, and we'll always listen with great care to anyone who wants to raise concerns with us. Thank you very much to all of you this evening. Thangam Debonair, Adam Bolton, Scarlett House and Alan Yentop. Thank you for your time. That's all from us tonight, and back tomorrow. See you then. Bye.
Live from London, this is BBC News. The former BBC News presenter, Hugh Edwards, is given a 6-month suspended prison sentence for accessing images of child abuse. Junior doctors accept a 22% pay rise. The government says the deal is key for the NHS. And the long-awaited hearing gets underway into Manchester City's alleged breaches of Premier League financial rules. Hello and welcome to BBC News with me, Laquesta Burak. After admitting his crimes, today came the punishment. Hugh Edwards was spared jail but received a 6-month suspended prison sentence on 3 charges of obtaining indecent images of children, with one of the victims in the pictures aged between 7 and 9. In all, 41 illegal images were sent to the former BBC News presenter, as his lawyer told the court that Edwards was profoundly sorry and that he recognised the repugnant nature of the images. The BBC has said that Edwards betrayed not just the corporation but the audiences who put their trust in him. His name is now on the sex offenders register for the next 7 years. Lucy Manning has our top story.
Hugh Edwards facing the camera. Not his usual one in the BBC studios, but the Metropolitan Police's after he was arrested. This, his custody photo. A far cry from his smart on-screen image.
Mr. Edwards, do you apologise? Mr. Edwards, do you apologise for your crimes?
Now a convicted sex offender, he came with a suitcase, prepared if his punishment was prison. The court heard disturbing and graphic details of his crimes, descriptions of the videos of children, including one as young as 7 that he looked at, and money he gave to another sex offender who sent them to him. The images were discovered in the WhatsApp messages of Alex Williams, who sent them to Edwards. The police were unable to find the former newsreader's phone that he'd used to look at them. Edwards' responses to the 41 indecent images are particularly revealing. In one exchange, he describes the images Williams has sent as amazing. Williams then says he can try and get more videos. If you like, 13, 14, 15, 16. Months later, Edwards says, don't send underage. But in another exchange, when Williams describes images he's offering as young, Edwards replies, go on. As the judge sentenced him, he listened intently, emotional as the court heard about his mental health problems, his suicide risk, and an upbringing where his failure to get into Oxford left him feeling like an outsider at the BBC.
Edwards, through his barrister, apologised. He said he wanted the court to know how profoundly sorry he was, that the images were repugnant and he recognised the hurt done to those in them, that he had betrayed the trust and faith of so many people and hurt and damaged his family.
But the police clear that when Edwards looked at the pictures and videos, exploited children were the victims here.
Behind every image is a vulnerable child that has been violated, that has been subject to abuse, and the continuing sort of distribution of those images only goes to service that demand.
Tonight at 10, thousands of police
Edwards was at the top of his career and the BBC, the man entrusted to tell the nation the Queen had died.
BBC Television is broadcasting this special programme reporting the death of Her Majesty the Queen.
Reading the news until he became it, initially suspended by the BBC last year in the aftermath of separate allegations in The Sun that he'd paid a young vulnerable man for explicit photos. The BBC, criticised for still paying him more than £200,000 after they knew he'd been arrested, said, "We are appalled by his crimes. He has betrayed not just the BBC, but audiences who put their trust in him."
It's very difficult to see any way that Hugh can come back. I think you should never say never in this industry. He certainly would never be employed as you know, the flagship presenter for a major broadcaster. Even those close to him had one view of who Hugh Edwards was, which is very different from the one that's been revealed in this process.
It is difficult to think of a more startling reversal of circumstances, from respected newsreader to convicted criminal. He'll now go on the sex offenders register.
As the judge said, his reputation is in tatters. Edwards breaking not just the trust viewers placed in him, but the law. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Our Home and Legal Affairs correspondent Dominic Casciani and Katie Rosal, our Culture and Media editor, have more on the sentencing.
About whether this is a lenient sentence, it looks like it's pretty down the line of what someone in Hugh Edwards' position would expect. There's a